So last time we talked about um, historical growth trends in GDP, and then focused specifically on the contribution of physical capital to GDP growth in the United States and the world. The next topic that ties very closely into this is human capital. So let me get specific about what we mean when we think about this. So you can imagine a farm, right? And we've already used the example of if I plant additional fruit trees, then I can have more more arable land under my control. I have more trees, and so naturally that's going to increase the amount of fruit I'm able to harvest from my farm. So that's an investment in physical capital that ultimately increases output. But you could also think about a different version, or maybe a phase two, where given maybe we've run out of land now, we're landlocked, we've used all of our available space, we've got all the trees that we can have access to. But now, as a farmer, I go travel somewhere and I spend some time doing research and talk to some companies farm supply companies or whatever. I come back with some new strategies for minimizing loss due to weather or to pests, and so now it's been an investment, right? As the farmer's invested in their human capital and their ability to run the farm well, and this can also result in an increase in economic output for the farm, right? That the farmer investing in themselves can benefit just like the farmer investing in his land or in his equipment. In economics, we talk about human capital investments just like we would talk about physical capital investments. So people can spend money and increase their human capital, and then improve their productivity, and then hopefully these investments make economic sense. So just as an example of a kind of human capital that can be invested in, this is a graph of educational attainment. So you can see this is the average educational attainment by birth cohort, right? So if you were born in 1880, your average educational attainment was somewhere between 7th and 8th grade. And then as time passes, right, we get to 1940, and so for every high school dropout, we have somebody with some college, right? And so you end up with roughly a 12th grade education being the norm in 1940, and that this continued to increase for a little bit and then flattened out at the end of the 40s. So that, by the time we're dealing with people born in 1980, they're not really doing much more school than would be expected. They're doing less extra school than the past trends would indicate, right? That if we had kept going at the rate we were in 1880, that the average educational attainment for people born in 1980 would be up in the master's degree level, right? And or at least, 15 would be at almost a bachelor's graduate, and so that would mean you'd need a lot of graduate degrees to offset people not completing high school. So that's by birth year, and if we look at the adult labor force, it looks very similar, right? That educational attainment has been increasing. So that's a form of human capital investment, right? So we have been investing more and more and more in the education of our workforce, and so, right, if that education didn't produce any economic benefit, then that would mean that human capital would have very little effect on output, and that's not what we observe. So we see human capital having a strong effect on economic output. Competitive with physical capital. So from personal experience, I know this is true with doing computational physics. So there are, of course, faster supercomputers now than there were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and that as we have advanced in computing and advanced in the number of processes and calculations we can do, we can calculate more complicated physical models. But the progress in successfully modeling and running mathematical models of physics on computers was driven more by improvements in algorithms than by improvements in physical computing, right? So yes, they are running on bigger supercomputers with more processors and more RAM and then and better performance per watt and all those kind of things, right? That matters and that helps. But even more than that was having smarter algorithms developed by mathematicians to more efficiently use computer resources or to tailor solution methods to particular classes of problems. There's all sorts of dimensions along which this gets pushed, but the result is that as much as computing has changed in the last 50 years, the algorithms computing uses to do physics have changed more. And we also see the same pattern in management. If you look, to tie this all the way back to the MBA itself, right? That a good chunk of the economic growth that we observe can be tied specifically to improvements in management as opposed to improvements in equipment or physical capital or other human capital. That like management innovations themselves are drivers of economic growth. And it's very easy to see how that could happen, right? If we think about, so a classic example would be the McDonald's. So I've only seen about the first hour and 20 minutes of the movie, but it's the founder with Michael Keaton. It's the introduction to McDonald's, and you see just how revolutionary the notion of a fast food restaurant really was. That getting your food right away and eating it out of paper was and having carefully orchestrated kitchen planning, and that all these incredible management innovations that produced a totally different restaurant product that has transformed the world, right? These are a management innovation that made a huge difference. Now, of course, right, they have electric ranges now, and there are physical improvements to where the microwaves beep, but really the design of McDonald's itself is a much bigger innovation than any of the technology that exists in the restaurant, right? So humans managing better and developing ideas and investing in themselves are as much a major factor as physical capital in driving economic growth. And we can see this in education. So this is a really interesting chart to show to people in the middle of pursuing higher education. So we hear all the time about how the college doesn't, the college degree doesn't pay what it used to, and that the college education maybe isn't worth the price tag. We get lots of negative press, and of course college has gotten much more expensive. But if we look here, this is actual data on the wage premium to getting a college degree, and if you see back into the 60s through 80s, there was very little economic benefit, right, in terms of wages, right, in terms of dollars earned. There was very little value from earning college degrees in that time, right? So, which is kind of shocking. You would think, wow, back in the 60s and 70s, if you had a college degree, you had it made. You were the elite because not many people got them. But the reality is, it didn't appear to have done much back then. But that the wage premium to having a college degree has been steadily increasing since the early 80s and is actually up to basically double, right? So and I think a way to think about it isn't necessarily that college is so amazing, it's that just having a high school diploma is actually not amazing, right? So back in the 60s, you could have a meaningful career with just a high school diploma, and that's increasingly difficult in our modern times, right? And that the difference is now bigger than it's ever been, even as more and more of the workforce is college educated, right? So how does this tie in to what we're talking about, right? This is just representative of the fact that we have more human capital investment now than we have in the past, right? That more of our workforce is college educated. Having a college education, it makes a bigger difference in pay, right? That human capital investments are happening on a much larger scale than they did in the past, right? That a couple years apprenticeship to a blacksmith may have been fine in the mid 1800s, but it's not going to cut it anymore. It's workers, to be productive at the level they need to be to maintain economic output as it is, workers need to have much more diverse skills and much more, have more invested in human capital than was true back then. So this is, again, focusing on education, but there's lots of ways in which you can invest in human capital. Education is just particularly easy to measure because we have lots of data on it. Physical capital is again, structures and equipment, among other things, but that is a very key ingredient in producing economic output. Just as important as human capital, investment in people themselves and making them more productive or investing in their productivity. But knowledge and ideas themselves have value. So just to highlight how true that is. So this is, if you remember, right? So back in the physical capital discussion, we were looking at the share of GDP that was consumed by investment in structure and investment in equipment, and we saw that after the post World War II, that investment in structure and equipment as a percentage of GDP was very flat, right? That this is consistently a little bit above 5, and then a little bit 10ish above that for those two categories. And you'll see this is obviously this is very different for these things. So this is investment in research and development. Right, so if we go back to the 30s and 40s, research and development was less than 1% of GDP. Right, we're thinking about the total. We've got a whole bunch of economic output in the United States, and we're going to take the big pie of economic output and commit 1% of it to thinking really hard about making stuff better. And that's what it was like in the 30s and 40s, and we can see now this is very, very different. Right, so in the mid 2010s, we're gone from half to 5, and you can see some of these trends, right? So in the 60s, we had during the space race, we had a ton of government R&D that has since backed off quite a bit. Private R&D has been steadily increasing ever since World War II, and that software and entertainment has just ballooned, and we have a ton of research and development in having better software and entertainment products, right? But again, we can think about this in terms of knowledge, right? That the development of knowledge and ideas is very important economically, increasingly so every year, and that it's now a significant portion of what we're up to economically in the United States. Like just literally the research and thinking, and it doesn't look like it's getting smaller, right? So you can also see this in terms of how many people are working in research. It's not just dollars, right? Because it could have been all spent on particle colliders or something goofy. We've got an increasing share of employment working in research in the United States. In OECD, that's an organization for economic cooperation and development. It's mostly Western European, although they can be scattered all over. But Japan is in, for example. But it's an organization of countries that work together for economic development. And so within that universe, we see more and more people working in research. And then even if you add China and Russia, we see more and more people working in research. So the investment in ideas, investment in knowledge as a contributor to economic growth is increasing, right? And it has been steadily increasing. We can see it's been steadily increasing since the 30s, right? So, and of course, we even say, we say this is the information economy or the information era. That information generation is actually something, it's very much what we're about. It's well, in the sense that we are investing resources in it, that we are committing people and time and energy to developing ideas and knowledge for the purpose, for in general, but for purposes to drive economic growth. That it's an important factor in driving economic growth, that investment. This is another way to look at the same thing. These are patents, right? So if you go back to 1900, we have 25, 30, 45,000 patents, almost all United States origin patents, right? So this is the U.S. Patent Office, but sometimes a foreign entity could file a U.S. patent if they discover, if a German company discovered something and they want patent protection in the United States, they'd file a U.S. patent, even though they're a German company. You can see there's not a whole lot of that going on at all until the early 70s, and but the total number of patents have exploded. Foreign patents in the U.S. has gone up even faster, right? And this is just an indication of, again, this notion that we're investing in knowledge generation, and patents just as that's a symptom of the actual situation that we're spending so much more on knowledge creation. And again, right, so and knowledge, just like physical and human capital, drives growth. So the last is misallocations. This is basically an opposite of knowledge, right? If we do things poorly or silly, take resources and put them in bad places, that this is going to hurt productivity, right? So the combination of misallocation and ideas together, there's more than just misallocation, but misallocation is a big part of it, sort of this catch-all category. You put them together, and that's what drives, we call it total factor productivity, right? The multiplier effect on the capital that we've invested in. And so this comes from a study from our reading, 15 to 20% of growth. So again, we're trying to explain growth, right? 15 to 20% of growth in aggregate output per worker, right? So this is, if we look from 1960 to 2008, workers got more, and there's more and more output coming from workers, right? More and more output coming from workers. And 15 to 20% of that output is explained by improved allocation of talent alone, right? So in particular, what we're talking about is if you go back to 1960, and so the example in the paper was you have something like 94% of lawyers being white men. Well, obviously, talent for lawyering is almost definitely not related at all to gender or ethnicity. Right? We have probably people who are just as good and just as bad at lawyering that are men as are women, that are white as are black, or a different ethnic group. Right? That these things don't really matter much in terms of the innate ability to lawyer well. Right? So if we see this incredible overrepresentation of white men in the law, what that means, right, in effect, is that we have some white men lawyering in 1960 that should have been doing something else because there was a woman or a minority who would have done that job better, but wasn't given the opportunity. So they use in the text, right, they mentioned Sandra Day O'Connor, that she, even though she graduated near the top of her class at Stanford, couldn't even get a job as a lawyer. She was working as a secretary. That changed eventually, but that basically it was this huge missed opportunity to put someone as talented as Sandra Day O'Connor in this minor role, but that's what was done systematically in 1960-ish, right? So that's misallocation, right? We have a resource, educated women or capable minorities or whatever it may be, that is not being correctly utilized, and the result is a reduction in productivity. Even though we have, right, so we've invested in human capital, and we have this capital that's ready to go, right? We have these people who could be perfectly capable lawyers or doctors or whatever it is, and they're just not being utilized. And so we stopped we're doing less and less of that. It's obviously it's not fixed, but as we get better and better at actually hiring the people who can do the jobs best, it produces more productivity. And we can say, based on empirical estimates from data, that 15 to 20% of the productivity growth in the United States over that period was a direct consequence of just knocking off that silly stuff, right? Like, just, we're not going to do that anymore. It'll fix. And the interesting thing is that this misallocation of that type still persists, right? So if you can go to different cultures and different nations, and where they do systematically still discriminate against women in the workplace, even in places we would consider to be fairly liberal democracies with high overall GDP, right? We can go into a place that has a ton of economic output, for example, South Korea, and see systematic under-hiring of women in those countries. And so if that were to change, you would see, right, the result would be, based on this data, improvement in aggregate output for that country. So just as an example of misallocation, so this is historical employment in agriculture as a share of total employment, right? So we go back to 1840, it's 60% in the United States. In Japan, it's almost 90, even later than that. And we see that the agriculture share declining. So what does that mean? Well, so this means that, in effect, if we had preserved agriculture share, right, at 60, so if we just insisted that the agriculture share of employment was 60% in the United States, and just leave it, that would be a misallocation, right? Because it wasn't necessary anymore for so many people to be working in agriculture. Obviously, it's, again, we feel this very keenly in Wisconsin, right? That you can have a family farm back to generations. We just don't need quite as many farmers, or the farms that we have can be bigger, can have more cows, or can be run differently. And so overall, over time, we see agriculture share and employment declining. But this is, in effect, a fix of a misallocation. Not that farm labor was misallocated in 1840, but that if we allocated it the same in 1840 and 1980, that it would be a problem, right? That would be a misallocation of resources, even if it wasn't back then. So it's the kind of thing that we see, right? So over time, people need to be doing different things, and that by moving to different things, it prevents misallocation. And so, just as a really fun, goofy little anecdote, if you ask kindergartners what they want to be when they grow up, so my daughter said she wanted to be a farmer, and that was actually pretty rare. Probably the most common answer that people get from little kids these days for what they want to be when they grow up is a YouTube streamer, right? So streaming YouTube was not part of the employment share, and now it's the number one, right? Now it's most important to kindergartners, right? So this is an employment category that didn't exist, that now is very important in maybe not your life or mine, but in little people we know, and that this is in effect the fixing of a misallocation. It never occurred to me in the late 80s, early 90s that I could film myself playing video games and then sell those VHS tapes to somebody and they would watch it and like it. It just never occurred to us, but with the advent of the internet and the ability of people to post whatever they like, it turns out people really like watching other people play video games, and you can do it and make a living at it. So surprise, surprise, there it is. So that was a misallocation that was going on the whole time. We didn't even know. that covers those four major input categories. Right, we could think about there, and there's maybe some nuance. Maybe we could add some extra dimensions to a couple of them, but those we could tend to stick things in those four major categories. So next is to think globally about economic growth. So in the paper they talk a lot about the frontier, right? Thinking about these countries that are on the edge of the growth curve, and what drives growth at the edge of the economic frontier, and that's different than what drives growth back in the interior, right? So if I have, for example, probably the number one thing that you can do to improve economic growth if you're not on the frontier is reduce corruption, right? So a dysfunctional government or a corrupt government or corruption in general is a huge damper on economic activity in general, and reducing it has a huge effect. Whereas obviously there still is quite a bit of corruption in the economic frontier, but but fixing it isn't the number one best thing you could do if you got to pick between what you were fixing. So so this isn't so much about but mostly in this little part we're going to look at how growth spreads, like the history of what growth spreading has looked like, and then infer something about what makes it do what it does. So this is kind of it's similar, right? So we've seen the United States version of this already, right? That we take off, right? That GDP growth is very slow and then it takes off. But now we've got countries all over the globe, and you can see that the takeoff part is actually timed very different, right? So the United Kingdom has, sort of goes hockey stick back into the late 1600s, early 1700s, and then is outpaced by the U.S. But right, I mean, a lot of that, right? I mean, a lot of the problems stemmed from spending on World War I and World War II. But we see the UK beginning, the structural shift into larger growth rates. Then we see it happen in the United States. We see it happen in Argentina. And then post-World War II, it happens in Japan. Early 90s, we see it happening in China. And in Ghana, we don't really see it at all, right? So we have plenty of places in the world that have never really experienced this sudden shift into accelerating growth rates, right? So that's part of thinking about growth spreading, being the other countries all over the planet experiencing growth, is that a lot of countries are still back in the economic regime of very low growth rates, like pre-industrial growth rates. And so whatever the structural shift that happens that makes countries switch from 0.1% to 2% hasn't happened for a lot of countries. So here we're looking at, these are all countries that have made the shift, but we can see this is back to 1870, right? And this is normalized with the U.S. at 100. So of course everybody's growing, right? We're all growing during this period, but the United States is normalized to 100. So if you're growing slower than the U.S., you're going to fall. If you're growing faster than the U.S., you're going to rise. And you can see within this group where the United States is the biggest GDP per person since roughly World War I, right, when the U.S. passed the UK. But you can see, right, so France has basically a fairly constant, a little under 80% of the United States. Argentina was competitive with France. It's hard to imagine that was true, but it was back in around the turn of the century or the past century, and has since declined relative to the United States. A lot of it is political unrest related, and then and similarly South Africa, though it started much lower, has drifted down since then, and we can see China actually doing very poorly relative to the United States in terms of GDP up until the reforms in the market reforms that are now having such a big effect. And so, but within, right, we can see within the sort of what we think of as I don't know, the West or the First World or whatever you want to call it, right? The UK, France, and Japan are all kind of hanging out together at about 75% of US GDP per person. So this is now the same chart zoomed in only in the post-1980 era, right? So this is a much more recent. We see Japan. You can see the lost decade, they say, of Japan, right? That by the mid-90s, Japan had almost caught up with the United States and then has declined relative to the United States since then. Western Europe has been staying in its exact same place. Russia went from being with Western Europe in the early 90s to much further. Right, they went from the mid 70s down to 20. Right, this is that log scale again, and have crept back to 40. But that's still half of what it was in 1990. And despite the economic, that we talk about Brazil as being a really amazing economic miracle of sorts, relative to the United States, they are pretty flat. And so China and India making gains, Africa's falling behind. So what really drives it? So this is part of the explanation. So here, if we look, right, these are, we've got a whole bunch of countries plotted on this chart, right? So what's going on? So on the left, we have GDP today, right? So if you're really high on this chart, right? If you're up high on this chart, you're wealthy now, okay? And if you're far to the right on this chart, you're wealthy in 1960. Right? You can see this consistent pattern that countries that were poor in 1960 tended to stay poor in 2011, right? That if you were at 164th or 132nd of the United States GDP per person, that's tended to be where you landed 50 years later. That there's some consistency there. And it's kind of neat to look at the outliers. So you see, first of all, a good two that stick out right away on the upper left there are South Korea, right? So we're very familiar with the economic miracle of South Korea, just that there's been huge economic changes in Korea since the Korean War, and economic liberalization and tons of things happening. But also something you may be less aware, but Botswana in Africa is really an incredible story in terms of gains on GDP per capita, right, they've and there's a lot of really positive aspects, so in terms of inequality, right? I mean, inequality is a problem all over the world, but in Botswana it's not as bad, right? So which is in contrast to, if we're looking in the lower right, right? So lower right is where we started bad and we got worse, right? That we got worse. We're seeing a lot of African, Congo, Nigeria, Zambia, Senegal, right? These are all sort of are doing much worse than you would expect given how they looked in 1960. And again, we can see we're not the top if you expand out and include Norway and Switzerland and Luxembourg. We have nations that actually have more GDP per capita than the United States. But again, the fact that this point blob is oblong as it is indicative that poor countries in 1960 tended to be poor countries in 2011 and vice versa. So, and this is in terms of GDP per capita, right? But if we look at growth rates, we get this interesting opposite story, right? So for growth within the OECD, right? So within the OECD, we have poor countries. Japan was very poor relative to the United States in 1960. And it had the best growth rate over that period. Whereas Norway was very rich relative to the United States and had the worst growth rate in the group. And So within the organization of the OECD, we have this opposite scenario where the poorer you were, the bigger your growth was. But if you actually expand that to the wider universe, right, so you can see the dark blue dots in the upper right, this whole universe doesn't have that pattern. This is basically just if I was to take a line and draw a line, try a best fit line for this data, I could spin it 360 degrees and it's all basically plausible. I mean, the best one is probably just a flat nothing, right? And so worldwide, this phenomenon doesn't exist, but within the OECD, it did. And so that probably speaks something to, right, to be committed to the OECD took a certain amount of organization and stability. And so even, poor Japan and poor Portugal and poor Greece and poor Spain, even though they were in a bad economic position, they made strides over time. But if you think about Greece got in the EU, and Spain, is now it's not a military dictatorship anymore, and so there were like major governance improvements in some of these places, and Japan had had an economic revolution post World War II, right? So that we think Ireland actually reinvented itself as it's now a financial center for the world. I mean, there's so many company headquarters are located there, right? It was just very different than what you might have known Ireland for in 1960, right? So within this organized universe, it's this pattern emerges, but for the bigger one, not so much. So this last one, this is the last chart of the day, and this one is extra tricky to understand. So, but the point is worth it. So what we've got here in the blue is, and again, it's a standard deviation of log GDP per person. But we can think about it, right? If I take all of the countries of the world, some of them have lots of GDP per person, some of them have not very much GDP per person. We're going to take all of that, and we're going to take this standard deviation of it. So again, that's a measure of spread, right? And this is in log scales, right? So this is in percentage terms. So the percentage, these percentage differences in GDP have been increasing over time from the 60s to today. And you can see it again in the ratio of the fifth richest to fifth poor. So if you're at the bottom of, right, so if you're at the bottom of the world in terms of economic wealth per capita in the 60s, you are 25 times worse than, or the wealthiest nations had 25 times more economic output than you did, and that has drifted up to be 50, right? As high as almost 60 at one point, right? That basically what we're getting at is that the disparity between rich nations and poor nations in economic output, even in percentage terms, right? In percentage terms, not just absolute terms, in percentage terms, has been growing, right? So in effect, that means that the experience of people living in poor nations is that their difference in their GDP per capita, right, and their economic output that they experience is much bigger, right? That the wealthy countries have tremendously more economic output per person than they do, and that wasn't always the case. It was always more, right? The wealthy countries always had more, but that difference is much bigger in percentage terms. And so you can imagine that might have geopolitical implications, right? If you're, if the country not too far over is incredibly fabulously wealthy, that might make you a little bit cranky at your local government, or make you want to emigrate, or all sorts of things can result from that. So that's it. So thinking about growth spreading, that's one factor, is that because growth has been spreading unevenly, the difference between the wealthy and poor countries in percentage terms is much bigger. There's just a bigger spread. So So that's the summary of my summary anyway of those sections from Handbook of Macroeconomics I asked you to read. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and I know that when I was at Arizona State, we had a Nobel laureate that was like 5 doors down from me that taught a whole 3-credit class on growth. And it was apparently almost totally incomprehensible, but that was partly because he was too brilliant to have it make sense for us lowly grad students. But like we had a lot of people trying. But there's a lot of, it's like, obviously from the reading, there's a ton of active research going on and understanding what drives it, and that's what makes GDP a number that moves the world.